Asian Americans, we have been through such a trying few years. And this anti-Asian kind of racism, hate is not new in the history of the United States. But I think the kind of visibility of it through social media, through news platforms and things like that, really kind of ignited a sense of who are we? What is our identity? What is our place here in the United States? And so, the book was born out of a desire to help our community start to integrate parts of ourselves that through immigration, through assimilation, we feel like maybe we might have lost in that process. And so I think now feels like a really critical time because pandemic almost forced us to kind of silence some of the external noise. We were in lockdown. We were kind of isolated, and it really highlighted the importance of mental health, which traditionally has been a highly stigmatized area within Asian culture. And so I think my hope is that this book will invite readers into almost reframing or reclaiming mental health to realize that it permeates every single aspect of our lives. It's not just a diagnosable condition or something in which you may need to go to the hospital for. It shows up in how we interact with people, how we make decisions, how we perceive our world. At its kind of top layer, it's for Asian diaspora communities. Although it's, the title says Asian Americans, I've had many people comment who are Asian living in UK, Australia, Latin America, who are saying these are themes that show up for me as well, even though I may not identify with the American experience. But being an Asian immigrant, these are things that really are at the surface of how I'm processing my identity. And so I think the target audience really, it is Asian immigrants, children of immigrants, individuals who maybe have grown up as first, second, or third generation in a new country outside of Asia. But then this book is also for people who are leaders, managers, directors, people who are impacting or leading Asian identifying individuals. Because part of our role as leaders, right, is to engage, is to really meet people where they are. And racial and ethnic identity is one facet of that. And if we don't understand how some of these cultural influences or some of these influences through, experiences with racism impact how Asians are showing up, then we have these clear blind spots in how we might lead and engage with our teams. I started the Instagram account Asians for Mental Health in September 2019. And really it was a two-pronged approach with that. One was that I was trying to identify Asian American therapists who were providing services for our community. And then the second kind of goal for this account was really to start talking about mental health from the lens of Asian diaspora, Asian immigrants. There were so many social media accounts that focused on mental health, but very few of them talked about the Asian American experience. And what's interesting is the timing of this account, because this was prior to pandemic arriving kind of here in the United States. And a couple months later, we started to see this increased rise of anti-Asian sentiment and harassment and attacks. And so as people were kind of trying to process the trauma of watching our people being attacked in the streets, I was actively then processing this even for myself on a public platform like Instagram. And so I think that really kind of created a safe space for people where they could come to kind of this platform and read about other people's experiences, understand that they were not alone, and also verbalize some of the complexity that we honestly as a community didn't really have language for. And so as the account grew, I think the book almost felt like a natural kind of next step, because there are people who don't access social media. There are people who don't understand what Instagram is. And so this book was a way for me to kind of really go deeper on the themes that I discuss on the social media account, while also providing a tangible kind of resource for our community, which then they could share with even their own parents, who often, right, really struggle with mental health and understanding its importance. I think one important aspect is this idea of taking up space or self-advocacy. Because I think within Asian culture, there is a strong emphasis on being kind of part of a unit or being a part of a community. So there isn't a lot of value in kind of somebody self-advocating, somebody self-promoting, someone being prideful of necessarily who they are or their accomplishments. There's almost an emphasis on humility, kind of staying under the radar, doing our work, and trusting that that would speak for itself. And yet in Western culture, self-promotion is almost part of the necessary skills to advance, right? Those skills that we need to kind of advocate for promotion or speak up and lead. And this now in the context of the model minority myth, right, here in the United States, which frames Asian Americans as being these kind of docile, compliant, hardworking, high-achieving individuals who don't really speak up for themselves. That will impact how Asian Americans are being viewed in the workforce, in our neighborhoods, in our relationships. And so we kind of have these competing kind of dynamics of cultural value of being humble, of not sticking out, and then also this kind of social or sociological effect of the model minority myth. So when you see an Asian American and they maybe aren't as assertive as what you would expect for somebody who's grown up in America, one thing to be questioning is whether or not they feel psychologically safe to take up space and to speak up. And psychological safety is an aspect of mental health. And so what can leaders, what can managers and directors do to build psychological safety in their companies? And what can they do to allow members of their community, right, to have the safety necessary to challenge, to question, to offer ideas without fear of being judged or retaliation? When I'm talking about the dominant culture, right, that's not necessarily just white culture. It's actually lots of different spaces in which there is a hierarchy. So be it power, be it gender, be it race or ethnicity, or even ability status, right? These are all stratifications of hierarchy that exist for human beings. And we all fall along different parts of that spectrum. And so dominant culture, right, is the part of that spectrum in which they have the most access to power, privilege, influence, and control. And so when we think about those systemic structures, right, if we're talking about race, we're not just trying to move towards diversity for the sake of diversity, right? Having a variety of, backgrounds. We're trying to move towards a space in which there's a sense of belonging for people who exist in spaces that are dominated by a certain culture or hierarchy. And so that belonging, right, is not just I'm allowed to exist here. It's not that I'm just allowed to, have a membership, a part of a group. It is a felt sense that I am safe, I am valued, right? And that I will be protected in that space if there's potential harm. And I think a lot of, corporate structures, a lot of even nonprofits, academic spheres, I don't think we're quite there yet, because people are not necessarily feeling safe and protected, especially as Asian Americans. Over the course of pandemic, I do a lot of corporate speaking. And one of the things that has arisen is, suddenly these companies are building these affinity groups for Asian Americans. And we kind of have to question, why have they not been in existence this entire time? And I think that speaks to this idea that as Asian Americans, for a long time, we've been the invisible race in America. It's been described as we are people who, due to our kind of proximity to whiteness, we have kind of bought into this idea that our race didn't matter, that if we just worked hard enough, if our competency was sufficient, then we wouldn't be judged by our race. And we realized that that was not true, right, over the course of pandemic. So those are kind of the structural pieces that I think I'm referring to there. But then as individuals, right, I think when we think about taking up space, it triggers a sense of fear, right? If you don't feel safe, then the idea of sticking out, speaking up, advocating becomes a threatening experience. I think as people of color, it is not our responsibility to change or kind of break down toxic systems on our own. That could potentially re-traumatize us. And so what does it look like to build those networks from the ground up and then to move forward through coalition building, through solidarity? So when we think about trauma, I kind of frame it as a felt sense that I'm not safe, right? Due to some type of experience that we have personally gone through, or what is called secondary or vicarious trauma, a trauma or threat against somebody that we know or we've witnessed, right? So as Asian Americans over the last several years, many of us have experienced secondary or vicarious trauma, right? I got to a point where I couldn't open up any social media accounts for a while because all I was seeing was people getting attacked. And that was activating my body and my nervous system that really kind of re-triggered some of my past racialized trauma or experiences as well. So when we talk about trauma in the here and now, what it does is it might unearth past trauma that we've worked really hard to protect against, to suppress, to hide. We have to be able to step away and create boundaries so that our mental health can be preserved sufficiently so that we can heal and start moving through that trauma. And so I think as a community, we are doing that in a variety of ways. People are finding ways to heal, but it is a journey, right? It's not kind of a one stopping point. It is going to be kind of an iterative process for our community. When we think about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about the trauma that is carried from one generation into the next, either through how people show up in relationships, the behaviors they may act out towards the next generation. So when we think about Asian immigrants, right? Some came seeking opportunity. They came with job opportunities, educational attainment, but many came fleeing war-torn regions. Many came fleeing, right, imperialism, colonialism, all of those effects, and as well as poverty and their own family trauma. So when these first kind of wave of immigrants came to the United States, not only had they gone through some pretty traumatic events in their homelands, many of them were perhaps on their own, under-resourced, unable to speak the language, having to survive, right, and build stability for the next generation. So there are several pathways within which intergenerational trauma then gets perpetuated on the next generation. One might simply be that if you have a parent who is working through jobs, right, going through their own experience of PTSD and trying to process what has happened to them, then how they parent may not be kind of the most adaptive or healthy. Either they're not present physically because of job responsibilities, or they're not present emotionally, which then the second generation has to kind of carry the burden of that. If a parent is unable to manage their own emotional life and mental health, they may secondarily, inadvertently or conscientiously abuse the next generation as a way to process their negative emotion, their own trauma. And so that's another way in which that trauma is carried forward. Filial piety is this concept in which really kind of came out of more Confucian values, but it kind of is a value system that governs or sets up expectations for how a child should engage with their parent. And so filial piety is this sense of duty or responsibility that we might hold for our older generation as a sign of honor, as a sign of respect, and perhaps gratitude. I think what becomes complex, though, is that there is this tension between the needs of our parents, either financially, time, right, energy, attention, and our own needs. Perhaps we have young families of our own. And so we're kind of sandwiched between the older generation and the younger. And so we may feel torn, right? Trying to meet the needs of all these different people in our lives. And so when we choose for ourselves, or perhaps choose for our own families, that may feel like we are not honoring or adhering to that filial piety kind of value set because we're diverting resources away from that older generation or our parents. And that can trigger a deep sense of guilt within our generation. On top of that, our parents, many came here and struggled. And so as children of immigrants, we witnessed that struggle. And so in some ways, there might be a sense of indebtedness or wanting to give back to our parents' generation for all the things that they sacrificed and provided for us. And yet, when perhaps we choose professions that don't meet those parental expectations, or we perhaps marry someone that is not what they're expecting, that may feel as though we're not honoring them, we're not respecting them, we're not giving them kind of the kind of payback almost in kind of what they may expect or what we may expect from ourselves. And so I think that tension is very real. I think as children of immigrants, we're constantly navigating that space and figuring out how do we keep ourselves a part of the equation in these relationships becomes a crucial point in how we protect our mental health. Hierarchy is something that is almost felt at a primitive level, right? Like I feel differently when I walk into a conference hall filled with people of color or Asian Americans compared to what it feels like when I walk into a conference hall filled with people who self-identify as white. And that's just kind of how hierarchy kind of is ingrained, is seeped into kind of our framing and how we kind of perceive the world. And so in the workplace, right, I think that's why we're trying to build on that idea of diversity, right, is that people feel different things when they're in the presence of different types of people within certain hierarchies. And that's not to say that people at higher levels of the hierarchy are bad or, are trying to maintain the hierarchy. They might not even realize that that's at play for people. And so in the workplace, one of the things that we may have to kind of think about is how do we start to equalize these relationships a little bit? People who are in places of power, how can they build trust? How can they build connection with people who don't identify with them? And perhaps these leaders can work towards being more vulnerable, right? Work towards being more humble and really try to meet people in spaces where they don't feel like they're maintaining the hierarchy, but instead disrupting it. And I think that's how organizations can try to build that psychological safety, which we discussed earlier, is could we start to reduce the hierarchy that exists between people and really kind of emphasize a shared humanity and dignity, regardless of your seniority or rank or identity status within the hierarchy. So when we think about the importance of representation, one, it has an internal effect psychologically. When I am able to see somebody who is in a higher level or position, a place of visibility, and internalize a sense of what's possible for myself, that has a transformative effect in terms of how people can dream for the things that they're hoping for. The thing is, though, with representation is that when you were the first and only, right, we're kind of left with a choice. Are we going to get in through the door and promptly shut it behind us? Or are we going to get in through the door and realize that perhaps we can hold open the door for people who come behind us? And so this then highly emphasizes mentorship, right? Which often, as people of color, we don't have a lot of access to. We also don't have access to the kind of promotion structure that often exists within organizations, but are not openly discussed. They're often very abstract. And so people are left to their own devices to think about what is the path to advancement? And so being the first also means that you might have a sense of responsibility for helping others create more clarity in their path forward. Amongst Asian Americans, there's a running joke, right? Doctor, lawyer, engineer. My own dad is an engineer. We are constantly surrounded by people who pursued medicine and things like that. And so it just felt like those were the only choices, right? And I think this speaks to model minority myth, right? Frameworks. At the same time, it also speaks to how, in our parents' kind of value set, the idea of scarcity was constantly at the back of their minds. And so wanting to give the next generation the tools, the leg up in order to build stability at an earlier point in our lives. Psychology was something that was so outside of the framework of a career that was viable, and at that time, I don't think I knew really any Asian Americans who were in the field of psychology. And so making that switch really was, in a way, manifesting some of the ideas that I talk about in the book, especially that chapter on permission to choose. Because I think in choosing this profession and this career, I had to, in a way, ground myself in this idea that this might be a very risky path for somebody with my identity and with my background. And yet, perhaps this is how our community breaks out of these boxes that we are traditionally placed in. And to be honest, it was not an easy journey. I think being in graduate school and academic settings, they are very white dominant. And so for much of my training, it was a dance of code switching between spaces and feeling as though there are parts of my identity that perhaps were not valued, were not seen as important within my professional realm. And at times feeling as though my identity might actually make me seem less professional and fearing, right, that perception. So I think that, the journey, especially in communicating to my parents that I was going to give up the stable career that they felt accounting would provide and move into something that they had no framework for, they had no models, no representation for it as successful Asian psychologists, it was pretty anxiety inducing for them as well. And so it makes sense why they emphasize these careers that seem very linear in path, right? And very structured. There was no ambiguity about kind of the steps you needed to take in order to become a doctor. So that felt safe. And I think that safety was prioritized in our parents' generation. The context has changed for our generation. Our parents, in their kind of hard work, set us up to be able to almost receive the benefits or the gifts of their hard work. And that, I think, is in our ability to choose for ourselves and to also prioritize values that may not have been something that they necessarily focused on, such as mission, purpose, meaning, impact in our work. I knew the title of this book before I even wrote the book. And I kind of see it as two parts. The first is within Asian culture, we've talked about kind of that deference to elders, that kind of wanting to honor, respect the older generation. And so it almost felt like, at least in my life, throughout my childhood into adulthood, I was always looking outwards and seeking permission, right? Constantly wondering, what should I do next? What would be the appropriate decision? What was the right thing to do? And always thinking to myself that I needed to ask others for permission to make different decisions in my life. And I think over the years, and through my own work and in journeying with clients, I realized that perhaps one of the things that may support our mental health is realizing that we could claim permission over many different spaces, that we were allowed to have an opinion, we were allowed to have agency in our lives. And so permission is rooted in this idea that perhaps we can offer ourselves permission to focus on the things that we care about, to live through the values that we uphold, and to choose, right, with intentionality about the lives we want to build. And then this idea of coming home, right? As an Asian immigrant, I've always felt like I lived kind of in this in-between space. When I go back to Taiwan, I'm too American, I'm too Western. When I'm here in the United States, I'm seen as sometimes other. I don't belong, I'm foreign. So as an immigrant, it can feel as though we live in this in-between and we don't have a home. There is no land, no space that is a homecoming for us. And so I think I wanted to end the book, or really focus the book, on this idea that perhaps as Asian Americans, home is a place or a condition that we must build for ourselves, individually as well as communally.